into this model of how we're talking about needs assessment. And I think the first thing that I kind of want to say at this point is that we're not here to prescribe XYZ way of doing a needs assessment and to say this is the only way that a needs assessment should be done, needs to be done, things like that. We are here essentially to think about what activities would help you understand better the needs of the communities that you're hoping to sort of serve with the projects that you do, and also for us to think about how needs assessment feeds into the entire design exercise, and if there's anything that we are doing currently that we would, kind of like to do differently, right? Right. Yeah, so we've actually gone through this already, so I'm just going to quickly run through it. We're going to look at what the importance of needs assessment is in design. We are going to see what are the ways in which you can do this process and needs assessment. Then we're also in this session because we're trying to give you a logical end to the course content before we take the break for Puja. We will also talk about program design along with needs assessment, program choice along with needs assessment. And so we'll also see how do you think about what program interventions are required to address the needs that you've identified. And of course, because when we're thinking about this from an evaluation perspective, we will try to see how evaluative thinking can be applied from the very beginning, right? I think we've already read this section together. I'm not going to go back into it, but what I'm going to do is, so we've seen a video, we've read some pieces about TAL, and I think the first question that was there in Suraj's first assignment was about needs assessment, right? What is the underlying need of the program? So that is something that we should try to sort of answer in every program that we are doing. So with respect to TAL, these are some of the responses that y'all have entered in your assignment. And I'm just going to read them. So the first one, and without obviously saying which is whom. So the first thing that is said here is that more schooling years, but less of learning. Over ambitious curriculum may not be able to cope with the grade level content, teacher only teaching top of the class, right? So this just one statement, if you look at it, I think 4 different needs are being articulated in this one statement, right? So, and it is very, okay, let's look at the next one actually. And then the second person has said, data clearly indicates children are not at the desired level of learning with their age groups, even though they're going to the proper schooling. This creates the need for the intervention, right? And third is, despite high enrollment rates, the academic performance of more than 50% of children was not at the grade level. And another important aspect that is brought out in this particular response is that there is a heterogeneity in terms of how much these children knew, right? Meaning that it's not as though everyone is at the same level, even if they are not at the grade level. There are some children who are 2 years below grade level, some who are 3 years behind grade level. So the teacher has to deal with a heterogeneity of learning levels in the class, right? And the last sort of response here is poor learning levels despite high enrollment. Even after 5 years of schooling, children do not learn to read or learn to read and perform basic operations, right? So all of these responses have come from you and have come from reading and looking at exactly the same material, right? So this in itself, I think, is an indication of how, even if we all have the exact same information, we can pull out from this various different needs as perceived by us of this particular community that we are trying to support with our program, right? So, and I mean, I wanted to sort of bring this out here because I think some of our discussions last time were about what is the actual need versus the articulated need versus the felt need, and how do we sort of bring all those together in terms of what is the actual need that we're going to address with our program. So I actually just wanted to pause 1 second and ask if there are any thoughts on these 4 different sort of ways in which needs of the program that TAL addresses have been articulated here. Does anything spring to mind for anybody?
I think Suraj has made a comment on this, Vidya. Are you able to read it?
Yeah. Exactly, right. That's exactly what I'm saying as well, is that there are some thing. I mean, we all look at the same exact information, but we've managed to pull out different things from this, and this may be very well what happens in a real life context as well, right? So we are shown, or we go to a particular community, a particular school, particular area, and see something, and we learn totally different things from that, right? So, but what the actual need that was addressed by the program is, has been done um, in it has been done in at various different levels. So the the need that they're trying to tackle, let's say, is that the learning outcomes are lower, right? And everything else that is information that is around that is the information that provides context, right? So we know that the learning levels of these children are low, and we know that there is variation in the learning levels in the classroom, right? And in the context of the fact that all these children have already been in school for 5 years, that they might have varying levels of support from home and things like that. So I think what uh, is interesting is how what you identify as the need is obviously what you will try to solve with your program intervention, right? Is there anything else that's jumping out at anybody else about any needs assessment that you may have done, uh, that was perceived differently by different members of the team, anything like that?
So, Vidya, I actually missed out the last workshop, but I went through the entire recording, and I found those questions by Namrata Rawat very interesting, where she asks, whose needs are we assessing? And but then I understand, and I you know went over it a couple of times, the responses that you gave and others gave, but what I didn't get is that, so maybe, yeah, we don't ask children what is your need, when we are doing a needs assessment. There is
Right.
a certain objective of a certain project, and we take the needs from there. Like, we have a certain desired goal towards that, and we say, "Okay, that is the need." And we are talking about participant needs being recognized as needs, or maybe they don't need that need. So, but are we kind of really doing something good, or are we kind of uh, doing something very concocted in our own minds? But then, would a child really be able to say that I really need this and this? I need 5 hours of instruction. I need
Hmm.
books to read. So that question sprung to my mind, and I couldn't really figure out a way to reconcile with it.
Yeah, I mean, and I think like off the bat, I should also tell you that I don't think we've, as a community of people who work in education, I don't think we've ever asked children in a in how do we say, in a reliable or respectable manner what their needs are, and try to actually listen to them, especially when it comes to learning. um, there are sort of standards that we think that need to be met, and we try to meet these standards for them, let's say. But I also think that in terms of needs assessment, it doesn't need to be especially when you're thinking of children, it doesn't need to be something that's done once at the beginning of the program and then never again while you're intervening, right? Even when you choose a particular, let's just keep TARL itself in mind. And once the intervention, a particular kind of intervention was chosen in order to improve the learning levels of these children, the other thing that was definitely thought about was how do these children learn, right? So,
Right.
in terms of let's have activities that engage all children in some way or the other. And you can possibly take at that point, I cannot tell you when it was done in that a qualitative feedback was taken from children, but you can really well take feedback from children in terms of is this activity appealing, right? Are
Hmm.
they is the quality of learning improving and not just I could not read before but I can
Hmm.
read now? That's good enough. To a certain extent, that's great that you're able to manage literacy. But I think one of the things that you could do in terms of a needs assessment is also to uh, like periodically take feedback on is this addressing the needs of the children, right?
Hmm.
Because they might say things like you would like more stories in the class, or we would like more activities in the class, things like that, which could give you very good insights on how
Yeah.
to tweak the intervention that you're thinking of. It doesn't, we don't need to think of it as we have to do it pre-program
Hmm.
always,
Hmm.
right? So yeah, that would be my only sort of way to think about including children in this meaningfully, honestly speaking. Yeah.
So then it would also require us to convince our funding agencies to say that needs assessment is like not something that happens right at the beginning, but we will do it concurrently as well. And for such and such reason, do you think it's possible to put up such a statement?
Sorry, can you say that again? I lost you in the middle a little bit.
Like from what I hear from you is that
Uh-huh.
needs assessment need not be a one-time, standard something that we do at the beginning.
Yeah,
It can be a concurrent kind of activity that we kind of ask and take feedback. And hence, we will probably need to speak to our donors also who see needs assessment as a one-time initial activity, a program or are part of a program which leads to certain design level decisions of for implementation.
absolutely. And we will, I mean, so there are two key sort of, um, let's say, facets of this course. One being the politics of this entire thing, right?
Hmm.
Who has the power in these conversations? And part of the goal is for us to feel more empowered to have conversations about these things and not let it be very one-sided, right? So I mean, and there is the person who's giving you money definitely has power coming into the conversation, but this is also for us to say, so there are techniques and skills that we will think about, but there's also us thinking about just how do you articulate this better in a position where you are asking for something from someone else and you want that they're able to give you the money to run your program, right? So I think there is, of course, I wouldn't say negotiation, but there is a conversation to be had about you cannot just address a need once before a 3-year program and then assume that what you sort of assessed is constant, right? And that's the
Right.
only need that needs to be addressed. And I think some in some contexts it is becoming easier to do this, especially when you are asked to take stock
Hmm. Hmm.
at the end of each year. I think it's becoming more possible for us to say things like this is not the direction in which we should be going, or things have happened over the year that are pointing us in a different direction to address a need in a different way or address a different need altogether, So yeah,
Thank you,
I did.
Divya. Thanks. Yeah.
No problem. I haven't looked at the chat though. Okay, there's a lot happening.
So Namrata Rawat has a hand raised.
Yeah, Namita.
Yeah, Divya. So it was regarding the question you asked about, how different team members perceive the idea of needs assessment or a specific program that we did. So actually, so if we go back to the TAL, when we are talking about learning, obviously, learning to me is a different process,
Yeah.
as I feel might be for the people who have actually done the program TAL. Because and also when we are talking about the learning level and the kind of tools we are using to assess it, I think at some point of time I also don't agree with some of them. For
Correct.
example, if we talk about the mathematical problems, why do we have to actually present the algorithm part and not the process part? So because there have been like a lot of researchers who talk about
Correct.
how like children are very good with street mathematics, but they might not be very good with the
Correct.
the numerical
thing.
part of it, the
Right.
textbook part of it.
Yeah.
So why are we still like using the textbook part of mathematics and not the real part of mathematics? So that is one part of it. So I think because the each vocabulary holds a different meaning for all of us
Absolutely.
through our experiences, our education, and the understanding we have developed so far. I think the process also kind of differs a lot when it comes to planning a need assessment process, or what kind of need we want to understand. So maybe I may want to understand that what kind of opportunities do we have, or by also looking at the challenges. But then there may be some like for example funders, like they are more focused about the fact that there's a problem right now and we are solving it.
Correct.
So that is something which we often see and face. And even if we are reading a program, sometimes there are like a lot of questions like why is it done so it can be done in a better way or a different way, or a like which is like very different for different people, I think.
Absolutely. I fully agree with you. And I do also agree that the way that interventions were designed in TAL may not be not may not be, is not the only way to address that problem, right? We can be quite sure that that's not the only way to uh, sort of address that particular need, that, whatever learning levels are lower than expected, things like that. And also what it is that you're choosing to target. So I think we'll talk about this much more, and I think it's useful that you raised it already, is that a lot of this often becomes a conversation around what is your skill set as an organization versus what are the needs that you are perceiving, right? What is your skill set in terms of what do we have experience with, what do we feel comfortable doing? And often I feel, at least in my experience, decisions come from that space more than what is the best way to address this need, right? And and we don't always have the opportunity to try out, um, if there are five different voices even within the organization saying these may be five different approaches that will work. We don't always have the bandwidth or even the space in terms of resources to be able to try out all of them. So we have to make some choices, pretty hard choices, based on either what we're most skilled at, what we have, what is easiest to do in terms of available resources, or what seems to agree most with either government partners or with donors. So there's lots of give and take that happens in terms of us trying to address identified needs, right? So I think I just keep sort of going back to there isn't one wonderful, like, gold standard way of doing this at all, but just some things for us to keep in mind in terms of how should we be, what all should we be thinking about when we do a needs assessment. And if you do get a plurality of voices from within the organization, or organization, donor, government partners, all the other, community, all the stakeholders that are involved, if you do get diversity of opinion, then how do we think about this? What do we do? Right? So I think the idea is to plant these thoughts, to talk about these issues of what do we do when there is doubt, I suppose. That's and I think everything that y'all are raising is around that, right? That it isn't as clear as, okay, these are the current conditions and these are the desired conditions, and this is how we bridge this gap. And it never really is in the real world. So Sorry, I'm just going back to the chat to look at Suraj's last comment, which is really, really sort of insightful, right? So he's talking about, sorry, Suraj, do you want to come in on that last comment, please?
Which one, Ritya, the input outcome
The,
one?
the very last comment you just made about 2 ways to think about needs assessment in TAL.
Yeah. So I think the conventionally the way to think about needs assessment is what we've been discussing, what we
Right.
discussed last class and so far, which is really outcome anchored.
Right.
So children are not learning enough, and Bal Sakhi is a potential program to choose, right?
Correct.
To fix that. But instead, we can think of need as children need to be taught at the right level, and they're not being taught at the right level. Conventionally, that is seen as program choice. But I think in the TAL experience, and as Dvitya, I think, described it, it's hard to separate the two. I think that was the point Dvitya was making earlier. On the one hand, the conventional outcome focus, what are the learning levels, no matter what's happened in the past. But on the other hand, there is this idea that conventional interventions have also not succeeded. And the problem, so in a way they're locating the problem as children not recognizing where children are at when you do your intervention, hence the right level. So yeah, conventionally it is program choice, but one can reinterpret it as part of needs assessment. That's what I was trying to say.
Right. Yeah, I mean, just sort of agreeing with Suraj, these two things are so sort of entwined with each other that it's not always very clear where one is ending and the other is starting, right? Sometimes we think program choice first and then think about, does it meet the needs that that this particular community has often, right? Okay. Yeah, so the important thing though, and I just want to bring it up again from what Suraj just mentioned, is that we need to sort of couple of sessions about output versus outcomes, input versus output versus outcomes, and the whole sort of gray area between what is an output and what is an outcome and things like that. But really, what do we want to improve? What do we want to change? What do we want the program to address? That is something that we need to be clear about, or we need to be in agreement about, let's say, between everybody who is part of this group that's going to conduct the intervention. Yeah, I just wanted to sort of take some time to think about, because it was raised last time, about any examples of needs assessments that you may have been a part of, you may now be a part of, and if people can just share what that experience has been like, and if there have been any dilemmas that you would like to talk about in terms of, you know, the ability to do a needs assessment properly or learn from it well, right? Okay, I'm going to move on. But at any point, if you want to draw parallels to things that you're experiencing as opposed to always thinking about TAL, that's more than welcome. So yeah. Yeah, one second. Yeah, which is something, the point Suraj is making is something that I think about very often, and I think I've mentioned a couple of times, is it really possible for us as a, you know, as an organization that is delivering programs, that's designing programs, to think about needs assessment independently, or do we always come to it from the lens of what can we do, right? Or what do we do? What are we good at doing, right? That's a very interesting thing to think about. Yeah. And I think this particular image is also something that we need to take into. I mean, it's a joke, but it's interesting because we often tell people what problems they have as organizations that are implementing programs. It's part of our job to tell people what problems they have, and I think a needs assessment will hopefully not elicit the response that I don't have this problem, and that's kind of what we're hoping for with this.
I think Seema ji made an observation which is quite pertinent and in line with what we're trying to say.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah,
This is
It-
generating a need just because I have a skill to solve it.
yeah. I mean, and
Yeah.
because this is what we're good at, we're like, okay, this is the need that I'm going to solve, right? And I think those two are very tightly, like they're very, very mixed up in our heads as implementing organizations for sure. And I mean, I come to it from a lot of experience implementing things is because you think of it from, I have this solution, where do I apply? I mean, like, I'm going to apply this solution here, you know? Can we think about it from a perspective of, are we capable of being independent, or do we think we need like an external organization to do a needs assessment, and then for us to see, um, do we have the ability to address that need, right? Yeah. So just sort of moving to, I think we've spoken about this a lot already, but why are we conducting a needs assessment, right? So often, I think uh, the default sort of response is, it's part of this process of design is to do some kind of a needs assessment. I can be kind of certain a lot of organizations don't even do it. It's also partly because of how the entire, proposal, bidding, application, donor process is set up, is that you're often applying to a call for proposals, or you're asked to do something by a government setup, an organization that is familiar with you, or someone says recommends you to do something. So often a needs assessment is not done in a systematic manner. We are responding, and even if you think about how call for proposals come out, they're also in terms of design and English language, like English language needs to be improved in this particular area, something like that, right? So the need is almost articulated right there. And what we are expected to do as organizations wanting to implement programs is just to align the things that we do um, with X need that is being articulated, which I don't know, which may or may not be a need. It may be what the policy mandate is. It may be where the money currently is. It could be a bunch of things that determine what programs we choose, right? So I think, how do we remain cognizant of this fact that we need to understand what the actual needs of this community are before we feel like our program is the answer to this particular situation, you know? And who do we involve in this exercise? How do we make sure that we are not generating the need, like Seema was saying? So these, like I was saying, this is not, we're not prescribing in any way as part of this course that this is how you do a needs assessment. These are just some things that you need to sort of, it would be useful to keep in mind when you're thinking about how you want to do it. I mean, thinking about doing a needs assessment. And the first thing really, I think I mentioned it before, is to be very clear on what why are you doing this and how do you plan to use this information, right? What if you find by doing a needs assessment that your program that or the things that you're good at or the organization is good at doing or has had previous success doing don't really align with these needs, right? So if that's what you found out, then how do you plan on using this information, right? And that's something that not not a lot of us contend with is what if these needs are not, I'm not the best suited to address these particular needs, right? And often, I think one of the important challenges remains um, constraints, right? Capacity constraints and time constraints. Everything is a deadline. We're the same people who are managing projects that are already running also have to do like the new sort of project design writing, things like that. And it becomes a question of what do you prioritize and how do you make sure that you're setting aside, you could have a very ambitious needs assessment plan and it may be exactly the needs assessment plan you need, but not sure if we have the constraints to, sorry, we're not sure if you have the capacity to actually go down that road fully and meaningfully and collect data, right? So it's important. And sometimes maybe we tell ourselves we cannot do more than this at this particular point, but that cognizance is important that there may be something here that we didn't know and we didn't find out, and we're going in without XYZ information that would have been useful for us, right? There is always things we don't know. We can never know everything that we need for our program design, but there may be key information that you think would have been good to have and you still don't have, and it's just important uh, to be cognizant that we didn't have the time to do this or we didn't have the capacity to do this, and we're going in with limited information on what we're actually trying to solve here, right? And the other thing that's important, I think, it also gets, we were talking about address needs in schools, is who do we talk to, right? And I think, I can't remember exactly who, but someone had raised this particular example in the previous session saying the government had asked for a training teachers that prevents corporal punishment, that against corporal punishment, something like that. And the teachers had said, we don't want this training because we think a little bit of corporal punishment is good or some such, right? So it's really important in that context in any context, but here it becomes very apparent that it's important who you're talking to, right? And what is the problem they're actually trying to solve. The fact that there is corporal punishment may be just like an intermediate step that's happening somewhere. What is the actual sort of need in the classroom, right? They want children to be attentive, they want engaged students in the classroom, they want children to participate. Those may be the goals, as opposed to we don't want the teacher to hit the children. That's that's in the middle somewhere. So really important who we talk to, who all we talk to, and what are the sources of information that we use in order to get a sense of what may be the needs. In the context of TARL, in the introduction that we did, they had used, of course, their own assessment, Asar being Pratham's assessment of the learning levels of the children. There was also some delving into existing research, right? What do we know has already not worked in this area? Giving them extra textbooks has not worked. Increasing the time that they spend in school doesn't seem to be improving outcomes. So this is also acknowledging and accepting previous knowledge that exists about what has worked. We could also very well ask community about what has happened already. Ask the teachers what interventions have already been done, and what has been their sort of take on it, right? One of the things that is always sort of a problem for me is everybody says train teachers, right? And then teachers get stuck in so many trainings that they're at one point they've tuned out of training. So we also need to sort of take into account everybody, like all the stakeholders, and what is their stand on what the need is right now, right? And of course, there's analyzing the data. In like, you've collected data from all these stakeholders, you've asked them a bunch of questions, you've tried to sort of bring up, what may be the need that needs to be addressed, let's say, and then we need to sort of bring all of that together. And once we have it together as an organization, we need to share it back for sure. If this is all given that you have the time, right? Because a lot of things may get lost in translation, which often happens. Maybe we've made meaning in a different way of something that was said. So it really helps to go back to people that you've spoken to say, this is what we've understood from the conversation, and do you want to give us feedback on this, right? And I find that in the limited experience where I've been able to do that, it has been really helpful. And we've seen things that they've pointed things out that we've not seen, because we assume, or let's say we're blind to certain things, right? Because of your own experience, your background, the lens with which you walk into this. So it's always helpful to go back to people that you've spoken to for identifying the need, and to just confirm that this is what was articulated by them, right? And of course, finally would be to use this information to try and design the approach to, to the program, or what do you want, what are the interventions, what should they be, what are the activities, things like from, the various stakeholders and what the needs are for this community. Are there any questions, comments at this point?
Hi, Divya. Actually, although all of the points are number 4, but the second one on
Yeah.
the slide.
The previous slide were all number 1. I was hoping no one would notice.
Yeah. So the middle one, get
Uh-huh.
feedback. I find this point very interesting. So do you have any examples for this one? Maybe from your own experience, where you actually went with some data in the community or with stakeholders, and it actually kind of directed your work. That is what I wanted to understand from you.
Yeah, so it's a small example, but in any case, so in my previous organization, we were once working on, so there is this whole, I don't know how much theory I should get into, but anyway, there is this whole World Bank concept of short route to accountability, right? Meaning, if you cannot go through the entire mechanism of accountability, when the community directly holds the provider of the service accountable. In this particular context, schools and school management committees, right? So these were the two sort of groups that we were dealing with. And in schools in Bihar, right, where there is very, very minimum supervision on what is actually happening in a school, right? So either the government mechanism is understaffed in many districts, so they can't send people to, like, the BRPs, CRPs cannot go to enough schools to find out what's going on, or there is some level of apathy, they don't want to do it, right? So we decided that we would design a community scorecard, which was something that as an organization we had done in Andhra Pradesh, had worked really, really well. And as a result, we decided to push this thing here in Bihar, right? And the challenge that we did not encounter in Andhra Pradesh that we encountered here was that there is a huge, like, gender, caste, class-based power clash that happens in a school management committee. The women may be committee members, they are never allowed to speak, they can't go and do anything by themselves. When we said, take this thing and go and fill it up, they were like, I can't fill it up without the head teacher approving it. And the whole idea was that you do it, it's an independent sort of an assessment, right? So we did not even think about, we just thought, train karenge, and then they'll be able to handle it because it's an easy enough instrument. We thought about the fact that their parents may not be literate, they might not be able to really tell you very much about quality of instruction, things like that. But what are the things that they can tell you about? So we decided to keep the indicators quite simple, but we forgot about a huge cultural sort of problem that was preventing any of this from happening, right? And this was not brought up to us at all till we actually, like, we did training of state level government officials, district level government officials. Everybody was okay with this. Only when we went to do the actual school level training were we told that this is such a big problem. And honestly speaking, it seems kind of common sense, and we should have thought about it. But for some reason, because we didn't encounter this problem in the previous situation that we'd done it in, we got into a lot of trouble where there was a need we had just not thought about. And then we had to sort of go back 2 steps and say instrument will come later, but we now have to address this whole power situation first and see who is best suited, how do we manage this dynamic before we can tell them what exactly needs to be done, right? And this is only because community was allowed to say this is not going to work, that we were able to like rethink of the program altogether. Was that useful?
Uh, okay. So, for example, I have the data from the community, from the need assessment, and I want to discuss. So, generally, what we do is we generally discuss the findings with the community and stakeholders. But right now, you are also talking about data.
Yeah.
Like discussing the data, which is, I think, a previous step before actually taking the findings. Am I right in this case? Like there's a difference between like using the data with community and using the findings with the community, like a step further.
I'm not sure I understand fully. Can you re-articulate somehow?
Yeah, so because you have written it here that discuss data with the community or
Correct.
stakeholders to understand and translate the needs.
Correct.
So what I'm saying is it's if it is like if we have to put it in a timeline. So when we analyze a data and we're coming up with some findings, that is when we understand that the assessment has been closed from our side.
Okay.
When we have findings in our hand, right?
Right.
What I'm asking is, when should we, like the point number, like the second point in this slide,
understood.
Is it, when we have the findings in hand, or is it before we are actually kind of culminating the findings? And if it is before culminating the findings, then like what kind of data and in what way we are discussing it with stakeholders and community?
See, so though I said data, I think I mean analysis, right? And by analysis, let's say findings, right? Because we want to know the meaning that we've made out of what they've told us. Is that actually what they were trying to tell us? Okay. Right? Yeah. And that is only doable if you were to go back to them and say, "Acha, humne ye analyze kiya hai. What do you think about this? I mean, this is what you were trying to tell us."
Got it.
Right? Yeah, I think that's kind of what I was trying to say, for sure.
Can I just add something on this?
Sure, sorry.
Yeah, I think this is a very interesting point that Namrata is raising. So if we think of that kind of other step that she's suggesting, so one is to do some kind of what is the current situation in the community regarding some particular focus on some aspect of schooling or something like that, and we collect various kinds of information, and one is to discuss the information we collect, right? The other is to then connect it with how things should be, right? The needs assessment is comparing how things are with some kind of feasible ideal in that context, right? And as with the ASSER data used by TAL, so they should be reading at this level, they are reading at this other level, and right. So one is to say where they are reading and discuss that with the community, and the other is to ask where should they be reading at, right? So rather than take that as an external benchmark, it's possible through community engagement for us to generate some kind of what is internally acceptable to the community regarding where let's say in this case children should be. Right. So in that sense, I'm seeing there's a value in what Namrata is saying. That is, on the one hand, take back to the community our information about where they are at, the current distribution of outcomes, so to speak. But then initiate another follow-on discussion as to where should they be, rather than take that as some kind of, policy goal from outside or some SDG or wherever. And that, I think, it's the latter, I think, which Dvitya is suggesting here, which is the full, the gap, discuss the gap, right? The data will tell us what the gap is, but maybe it's worth splitting the two, was my thought.
Extremely interesting. Though I would love to hear thoughts on this from others, right? Because, yeah, I mean, I was just thinking about it while you were speaking, and I had so many thoughts in my head about how to do this. So I'm like, does anybody have any experience of having done this in the past? Asking community or asking the actual people, the stakeholders, what do you think the desired outcomes should be, as opposed to us telling them, this is what the goal is, and this is what we're going to try and achieve.
So I think parents' aspirations, like caregivers or parents, as a source of data finding, we do reach out to parents and community that way. Not children so much. I don't think we have done that, but parental aspirations and their needs have been taken into consideration, and we have included that in a lot of our questions. I think Mustafiz, when he was setting up learning centers in Birbhum, like we have, and Rajarhat, we have done these kind of questions, and I think the kind of responses that come are, like bhalo manush hoy, one is like that, philosophical kind of a stance where, we want the certain values and certain, aspects of humankind that we want generally, and another set is that, English aana chahiye, and that they get good jobs and they can work in offices. So that is the other kind of response. But so yeah, in terms of community, this is one thing that comes to my mind, that kind of responsibility. But even I think language has been, when we tried out, we had some questions in Maharashtra. So we actually got to know that 15% of our target community was Hindi speaking. So they said, when you send us Marathi content, hame nahi samajh mein aata, to hum Hindi content bhejiye. So those kind of things we did get.
Right. And this was at the beginning, before, at the design stage, or after, like in the middle of the engagement somewhere that they're saying?
Parents was at the beginning. Okay. But then, parent meetings keep happening. So, that whole, that concurrent things happens. And the Hindi one was like a dipstick assessment that was done. See, I think 6 months into the program.
Right.
We wanted to see, because it was a COVID time and we really couldn't reach out to parents so much. We wanted to get a sense of how much our inputs are going to the children.
Correct. Yeah. I think I've had a similar experience on a program that I was just evaluating in Maharashtra, actually in Amravati, where almost 40% of the children, this is a program that deals with children in Anganwadi, and 40% of the children are Urdu speaking. They don't, even like the Anganwadi teacher teaches in Urdu. There is no Marathi in their lives because, and all the organization was providing all content in Marathi,
Yes.
you know, and
Because even at the systemic level, the CDPOs or supervisors or the ICTs, they don't tell us that हमारे इतने बच्चे हैं Hindi speaking, इतने बच्चे Urdu speaking. So we don't get that from the system.
Yeah, and it was something that was only found out, I suppose, at evaluation stage, right? Which was it's 2 years into implementation, and it's also something that was designed during COVID. So it is content that is, educational content sent to parents on WhatsApp, something like that.
Yes,
and
yes.
even parents don't understand Marathi in a large number of these cases, and it was essentially useless for them for 2 years, right? So yeah, so that's, I mean, it's a very good example of things that you may not see, or things that you assume based on information that you have, which may not be true at all.
Seema and Rahul have the hand raised.
Seema also. Seema, would you like to go?
Yeah, please. I can see no hands.
Yes, Rahul, go ahead.
Okay. No, I was thinking of the issue which Namrata brought up in terms of the language question. And again, if parental aspirations sometimes dominate needs, in a way, educationally, say particularly the language question, that can be problematic. So we have communities being served with only English medium schooling, where mother tongue based multilingual education is being ignored. In the sense that parental aspirations and needs, so-called, has been identified as English, as that children want to learn in English. I think negotiating that terrain also probably requires some thought, like whether we take needs. So this expertise versus community kind of a participation. Where do we draw the lines? Where do we? How do we merge or converge on needs? Again, that might be a kind of a question which needs to be looked at carefully.
It's such an ideological stance almost, one way or the other, whether you're saying English medium or English language is highly important, or we're saying home language or mother tongue is highly important. I feel like it's an ideological stance almost, and I'm not sure. I feel like aspiration in that sense, at least in my experience, seems to be quite well spread out in the community, in many communities that I've worked with, that English is important. I don't know if it is some kind of pressure that's coming from, I mean, it's externally created need for English language, right? But yeah, I find that's quite hard. It's a very difficult conversation to have with parents.
True. Most of the times, specifically we have been engaged in capacity building programs for the community, right? Be it caretakers, teachers, or even parents. And definitely a need assessment happens over there to a large extent to understand. Some of them is just felt need, and some of them is actually, through surveys that you get to know that this is the need of the community. But as we were discussing the language part of it, where, I gave this example of Amravati. By the way, I happen to hail from Amravati. So yeah. So what happens if across Maharashtra, if you say, take typical example, we would have about 1,20,000 Anganwadis, right?
Yeah.
And one section in, as we took that example in Vidarbha and Amravati, would be specifically, Hindi or Urdu speaking. And of course, there are some tribal areas where they have only their local languages. So when any of these programs get, rolled out pan state, right? these outliers are
Yeah.
left out.
Correct.
Yeah. And some, of course, it is, if it is my need, it is my language need, it is very important to me. And of course, I wish that, I get that communication or education in that particular language. But for larger programs, even if you do the need assessment and, if it doesn't fall in your bigger chunk of the curve, the outliers would definitely get, ignored or lost out in that frame.
Yeah. I think two important things from what you're saying. A, that there are outliers, and B, the acknowledgement that you're leaving these people out, right? That I feel most people don't have, which is sometimes maybe you say nahi ho payega, I don't have what it takes to do Urdu.
Yeah.
So, but remember that and articulate that this is being left out. It often happens, I feel, out of ignorance or of just thinking, or of just like gathering information about the majority and then sort of moving forward with that information, right? And it's not, I cannot pass any judgment on that at all, because I'm fully aware of the kind of constraints that organizations operate under. You don't sometimes have the luxury of time to spend all this time finding out exactly what you need to do. So yeah. Yeah, I think I'm just gonna... Yeah, I think what Namrata is saying and what Suraj and Rahul raised as well is this balance between some kind of expertise versus needs articulated by the community, and how do you balance those is probably where is the zone where all our our concerns are coming from at the moment, in terms of, do we then decide what is the desired outcome? Do we articulate it and work towards it? Or do we use SDGs, which are saying everyone should be able to do, all children should be able to read, or children should be able to do whatever mathematics, things like that? Or do we go with it's sort of the need being organically, the desired outcome being organically generated from discussions with the community that are probably facilitated by some conversations around what is expected to happen at X class, things like that. Sorry, just another example that came to mind, which I wanted to sort of share, is I can't remember which year, maybe it was 2015 or 16, but the state of Jharkhand, they decided kind of overnight that they're going to move to English medium, and that English was an exam that everybody needed to pass in order to be promoted. In class 10 to be promoted, you needed to pass English, and till then it was given zero importance in their curriculum, right? And then they brought these textbooks from NCERT directly to these children, and there was 2 years of utter chaos, because neither the teachers are equipped nor the children are equipped to handle this overnight. But this was the need that was sort of felt by the state, that children need to be able to communicate in English, that they need to be able to read and be fluent in English, whatever, by the time they finish class 10. And they just decided to turn things over, like quite literally overnight, saying from June, whatever, we are going to do everything in English, right? So, and that kind of need, when it comes from the state and it has been implemented, organizations often have no option other than to try and support teachers, try and support communities to help get over this get over this hurdle, right? There isn't anything else you can do, even if you don't agree that this is the need of the day. So just to say that sometimes you are presented situations where you don't really have an option but to deal with a need you may not necessarily agree with. Like, it's just there and you have to cope. Yeah, and similar to what Suraj just said in the comments about community and then this English medium thing is very, very well passed on in many communities. Right.
I think Megha has her hand.
Yeah, me.
So I just wanted to share my
Sorry,
perspective
I can't
on.
quite hear you. Is it me?
Am I audible now?
Oh, yeah, yes.
Yeah. So I just wanted to add my opinion on the need assessment.
Sure.
At times, I feel that yes, nowadays, even this in this commercialization, at times we don't need things, but community don't need things, but it is believed, it is made to believe them that yes, they need certain kind of services or products. For example, we have a lot of edtechs coming in during and post-COVID situation, realizing that learning loss is very important to address.
Mhm.
On the other hand, there are so many at that point of time community was suffering, especially if I take this COVID situation in mind. And I'm really sorry about this background noise. It's just started.
No, it's fine.
I hope you hear me.
Yeah, yeah.
So yeah, so I just wanted to know that yes, there are a lot of there were a lot of things going on, and the children, especially if we talk about children, yes, learning loss was a bigger term that was very much used during that point of,
Mhm.
and of course it was the need of the hour. But how to know which need is more prior and more immediate than the second one? Like addressing learning loss was more important, or addressing their social emotional development was more important at that point of time. So that is where I get stuck. That yes, at times we know, we understand situation, we come up with our own expertise that this community needs this, that community needs that. But which kind of need is more prior than the other one, so that we can prioritize our program activities accordingly.
I don't think there's a reasonable way to answer that question because it becomes always about a perception, right? Someone is perceiving X need as more important than Y, and it is your best judgment at that point in time. What do you think is the need that is priority? And second being, what is it that you think you are most suited to address, right? You might realize, let's say, I don't know the context very well, but I'm just saying, you might realize social emotional needs are higher priority, but you may not be suited to address those, right? In the sense, you as an organization may not have the skill sets that are required to address those, and at which point you may have to think about it sort of differently than to say which need is more important, because it's a combination. It's always a combination of what is the need versus what do I have the ability to solve, right? Because very broadly, if you look at it as an organization that deals with education, you don't really think about let's say water and sanitation issues very much. That's a very broad distinction that we've made in our heads. But even within the space of education, like you're saying, there may be things that you have to decide, this is not my place um, to try and address this particular need, right? I think that is where I would come from, rather than thinking which is uh, a bigger priority, because often it's not clear, right?
Thank you for answering.
Yeah. No, I don't know that was useful answer at all. But I don't, it's very hard. I understand your position, but I don't
Yeah,
think there's a
I
good answer.
understand. At times,
Yeah.
this dilemma happens that when we prioritize activities as per the needs, but then at times it comes to me like which which kind of activity should be given priority than the other one.
I mean, maybe that in that context, your position is just to find, if it is not possible for you to do both, then find someone to do the other one that you're letting go of because you don't have the bandwidth, and to articulate to someone else that this need needs to be addressed. Because broadly, the goal is that needs need to be, I mean, these needs need to be addressed, not specifically by whom. So yeah, that's maybe a way to think about it that doesn't have you feeling bad about not being able to address it. Right. I think we've probably spoken about all of this already. Of course, it takes time, which sometimes we don't have in order to do a needs assessment. Often it takes people and money that may not get paid for. A needs assessment exercise is sometimes outside the purview of a donor's, what a donor is going to pay for. In some cases, they expect that you know the needs and that you have the solution in hand, and they will only pay for implementation and not all the thinking that goes into design. So resource constraints are a real problem in terms of allocating the time that's required and the effort that's required for a well-done assessment exercise. Complexity of the problem, that's something that everyone has mentioned, right? There is competing needs. There are like different parts of the community have different needs. It's not as simple as like, one need is articulated, one problem is, one program intervention is going to solve that particular need. It's never as simple as that. And often we have to let go of some strands of the problem because we may not have the ability to address those. And there are various issues outside the control of the program that we will be impacted by, which will have an influence on how things that we do actually materialize on the field, but we may not really be able to do very much about addressing, these factors that we do. These are, I mean, in my head, these are primarily society related things that we don't necessarily deal with when we are talking about, and when we're thinking about our internet. Yes, is there a hand raised? Athma, if you want to say something. Should I move ahead?
Actually, sir, are you here? Do you have a question, Atanu, sir? I think we can move ahead with that.
Okay. I think this is just something that I find myself thinking about a lot, and in conversations with y'all over the last hour or so, I've had myself questioning several needs assessment exercises that I have done. So I'm just wondering if you could, I mean, just take some time to think about, is there anything you're currently doing or anything that you've done before that you think would benefit from, some kind of change in approach? Or is there, a new perspective that you think you could bring into a needs assessment exercise that you have done before that you had originally not thought of? Something like that is, if anything is coming to mind, it would be nice to share it. Rahul wants a break.
I yeah, I actually have a question.
Yeah, please.
See, Vidya, the thing is that sometimes, oh, Rahul wants tea.
No, but we take your question and then go.
Yeah, so the thing sometimes I find myself just thinking that when we begin talking about needs assessment,
Mhm.
you see, there can be like this wide array of questions that we can go with in the field. I'm not talking about absolute questions, but things that you can observe and things that you can collect from the field. And it does become, if you go, completely just for the first time, say you're entering the field, then where do you draw the line? Like, how there's like plethora of information that a field can offer, but
Okay.
how do you go about uh, sort of deciding that this particular information is enough for me?
Hmm. I don't, oh my God. I don't think um, I don't think there is a prescribed way of deciding it's enough for you. I think it often gets determined by how much time you have and how many uh, resources in terms of either human resources or financial resources in order to conduct an assessment. I think that's often the determinant, um, which may not be how you call it ideal. But I think thing to remember is also that we may often not be the first people who are doing a needs assessment in that region, right? Because or in that particular community. I think at least in the education space, I think a lot of people work parallelly um, in similar areas and often seen as competition to each other. But there may be a wealth of information available either from their implementation already or from needs assessment exercises that others have done that they may have written about somewhere. I mean, there's also, someone I mentioned in the chat, thinking about, uh, anthropological research and things like that. But I'm sure that there are other sources of information other than us collecting primary information for the first time, right? And like fully agreeing with what Suraj is just saying is that
Yeah,
if it's your first time in the field, then that the approach would not be to just collect primary information the first time, right? Would be to find out what everybody already knows. Like previous knowledge, incredibly useful in this context. There may be government information that's useful as opposed to us collecting primary data, or just to get a lead on which direction do I probe in more, right? Because I mean, if it were left up to us, I think we would never be happy with all the information that we have because you can never have all the information that you want. So
thanks, Vidya.
I'm not providing any answers other than saying I don't know today. But um, yeah. But I think it's kind of useful to know that there aren't any real uh, fixed approaches of doing this, right? It also gives us a certain bit of assurance that it's not like this ideal way of doing this exists somewhere and we don't know it. Right? Uh, that's totally not true, right? I think everybody is just trying to find their way in the middle of all this, and we do it based on whatever constraints we have, right? So I think this is probably a good point to take Rahul's tea break. um, and we're progressing along well, actually. So should we take a real break? Because I mean, yeah, I think let's take a real break.
When do we come back, Ditya? 6:05?
10 minutes? Yeah.
Yeah.
That's fine. Yeah. You don't have to think about the course at all. Could people just let us know somehow when you all are back so that we know everyone's back? Raise your hand, something so that, okay, wonderful. Excellent. I think most people are back, no? Between hand raises and messages, I think everyone's there. So share screen. Right. So this is where we were. So I think, okay, wonderful. So I think everyone's here. So this is just, I mean, we've discussed a lot about program choice while we were talking about needs assessment itself, and I find it quite hard to think about them very distinctly because one feeds into the other quite tightly for me in the way that I have ever thought about program design or implementation. So I think so moving on to choice really is about, and something that we do quite organically, I think, is to think what interventions would address sort of the needs that we've identified. And just briefly going back to teaching at the right level, there may have been, and a lot of you who have submitted the assignment have indicated not sure, right? The second question we'd asked was, is this program the best suited to address this particular need? And a lot of people have said, we're not sure. Now, I think with teaching at the right level, they've done 10 years of um, research of mostly impact evaluation. There's a couple of anthropological studies that have been done also about what has been the experience of being part of the program, interviews with communities, with teachers, things like that. But they have established this particular method works, let's say, right? But was there a method that could have worked better? That is a question we don't necessarily have the answer to, even with a program like Teaching at the Right Level that has had so much research being done alongside alongside implementation, and quite often have the luxury of that kind of support in terms of evaluating, do we know that this is the best way to do this, right? I mean, teaching at the right level doesn't know it's the best way to do this. As a result, I think it's kind of fair to say I'm not sure we would ever know this was the best approach to do it. But I think what we can really think about is articulating quite clearly, or trying to articulate quite clearly, at least within the organization at the time of design, is how do we think this particular program intervention that we're choosing, this particular input we're providing, is going to address the need that we've identified, right? In one of the evaluations that I've recently sort of been a part of, there are several components of the program that are being delivered, have been delivered for the last 3 years, but nowhere in either a design document or in any articulation with the program staff, have they been able to reliably communicate how do we think A component feeds into B component, feeds into C, uh, which will address the need, right? These are the things that we do well. These are the things that have maybe individually worked in another context. And as a result, we're now putting them all together in the hope that it will address this particular need. So I think it's quite important to make the connection between needs assessment and program choice. This does sound, as I'm saying it, it sounds so basic, right? And very, very commonsensical that organizations are obviously doing this in thinking about what was the need versus what is the program we've chosen to implement in this context. But there are very, very many cases of people not thinking about it in that direction at all. And we'll come to it in the evaluation of implementation when we talk about it in the upcoming sessions about how do you sort of make a process out of this thinking. How do we make sure that we're thinking about this? But right now, I think we're just thinking at a very high level on how do we choose interventions based on the needs that we've identified, not only the needs we've identified, but also the needs that we have somehow prioritized, right? Because as we've spoken here, there are often competing needs, and we've maybe chosen to prioritize one over the other. And as a result, that's the need that we're trying to address. Even in the context of teaching at the right level, there may have been social emotional learning needs that the program did not delve into in any format, right? They didn't even, it is not within the scope of their needs assessment possibly. It's not within the scope of what they think they're equipped to do. And as a result, it's a need that is neither articulated nor addressed by that particular program, right? And not to say that it's a bad thing, but it could very well mean that I don't have as an organization, don't have the skill sets to be able to address that particular need. But the acknowledgement, the articulation of that fact is quite important, like I mentioned before. Right. Like I was saying, this is just some thoughts on how do needs assessment and program choice really work together, right? And often we come into situations where we've already decided that has worked well in a particular context before, we've had success with it, and we may have been asked to shift it to another location. Okay, it's working here. Can you please move this, either scale it up to the remaining districts or to move it to another locale altogether where we want this program to work. Especially, I find this happens in the context of English language things, right? That if it is work, like it's almost identified as a universal need. Every school, everybody needs to learn English. So if you had an approach that is work, can you please do it here as well? It could be a government mandate, it could be a donor mandate in terms of the donor funds programs in all of these locations. You're working in one of them, you're asked to take your program to another location. So this starts often with program in mind as opposed to needs in mind, right? And a needs assessment exercise at that point may or may not be allowed even, right? You may not get the space to even think about or allowed to figure out, is this need the same even in this particular context, which is something that I have found myself a lot in, and I imagine a lot of implementing organizations find themselves in this situation where you have mandates that you have to sort of work with, as opposed to being allowed to discover somehow what's the need for this particular group and how do we address that, right? And like I said, the answer sometimes may be we are not best suited to address this need and another organization needs to do it. And that is also often a difficult choice that organizations don't want to make, or maybe don't have the luxury of making, right? You need to also think about um, like financial aspects of being an organization that implements programs. So there are a bunch of constraints within which we often come into situations with intervention in mind as opposed to need and outcomes and desired outcomes in mind, right? Second problem is also a situation where we're not able to get a good measure of the outcomes in the current state of the outcomes in the needs assessment phase. This could be a time thing, it could be a resource thing, or it could just be that the problem is complex and there is not an easy answer to this is the current level of outcomes in this particular region or in this particular locale where I want to deliver, especially things that are very, very nuanced. Like I keep bringing up this example of this socio-emotional learning, right? They're very nuanced aspects and often trying to nail it down into boxes using rubrics and instruments may not give you a very clear picture of what exactly is going on. The problem is complex, it's layered, and you don't necessarily have a very good idea what the need is and how you can best sort of address it. And the final one is, I think, in my opinion, the most important one and the realist one that we encounter is that you don't have the ability to compare, like to implement 3-4 types of interventions and see which one is working better. That could be I see that there could be pushback from donors for you doing that. It could also, there's a huge ethical sort of a background to us just trying things out in our context on children in schools, right? To say, let's see if this is working for you. We'll try this with an other X number of schools and see which one's working better. That kind of standpoint was often taken in experimental cases, like when you're doing an RCT, you sometimes have various different what they call treatment arms. So X children get X number of schools get X treatment, X get Y treatment, and then you figure out which one's working better. That is, in my opinion, it's very, very ethically like tied up. It's ethically quite confusing whether you should be able to, whether you should do something like that or not. And this just brings one example to mind, and I think someone raised it about COVID learning loss, right? So there is learning loss during COVID. This was almost considered universal as a need that children have, especially in the context of India, where schools were closed like for in-person things, 1.5 to 2 years in most of the country, right? And the assumption was that children have not learned, right? They've fallen behind, or they've forgotten what they were actually learning. So they might not even be at the previous level that they were when they were going to school. All of this was assumed to be a reality in all schools, and we had to somehow tackle this problem. And there are 1,000 ways to address this particular issue, right? And people have tried, I think, 2001 of these approaches in order to try and fix this problem of children having learning loss. And in one of the sort of projects that I've seen, the need that was identified, in addition to, the contributing factor for learning loss was that children of a particular socioeconomic background do not have access to digital devices, right? They can't do online classes with a phone because parents don't have a phone that they can spare, or they don't have the resources to spend on internet connections for audio or video calls for that long. They're not familiar with WhatsApp. There was a bunch of things around the digital divide, which was causing, some kind of heterogeneity in the learning loss, which was the problem that was sort of being tried to address by one of the programs that I came across. And they had decided to issue physical tablets to children going to government schools of a certain age group, and said, okay, now that you have the device, then you should be able to access learning, and as a result, your learning loss should be reduced, right? Now, this, if you think about it in sort of the timeline of things that happened between me having a device and me actually learning better, there are so many variables that contribute to this, that it's not just that because I have a device, I can now I'm now, my learning loss is now going to be bridged, right? So they found various things happening in terms of parents using the devices, or because parents being scared of, damage being caused to that device just being locked away for, for an entire year, children never got access to that device, or, internet not being available in some, where the program was being implemented. There was many multiple steps in this journey from this is the need to this is the intervention that will solve this need, that kind of were not really thought about, because there was no assessment of what exactly is the reason you are not able to, you're actually losing learning, right? And yeah, so it's not always, we don't always have the information to compare choices, but we also always don't really know we don't take into account what all are the various steps between us choosing a particular program as the solution, or as the way in which we're going to address these needs. We don't really realize what all the steps that there could be. So that, I think, is something that we need to think about in terms of program choice. I think there was an image somewhere that I seem to have skipped through. Give me 1 second. Oh, it's coming up. I want to see it right now. So there is this image that you look at here, which is often how programs are thought of. X is the need. This is what I'm going to do. Then a miracle occurs, and then the outcomes improve, right? Because we don't really think about all the various things that happen between me doing one program and all the other factors that are coming into play here, right? So I think that is what I was saying in terms of, we don't really ever know what all the choices that we have, and how do you compare these options for program choice, right? So given that this is sort of the context, is that we may not have all the information, that we may come into this with a specific mandate to address, or that we may not have the option to compare, the various programs that you could possibly implement. What we typically end up doing is doing things that have worked in the past for us, in possibly in different contexts, maybe in the same context in a smaller area. It's still possible that that's what we're doing. We may end up including things that fit within the budget, right? You might think what I want to do is 10 days of training, just like a broad examples. I want to do 10 days of training, or I want to do 10 sessions with the children. And then you realize that your donor is not going to pay for 10 sessions because it's outside the the price point that they're willing to fund. And then we have to sort of tone it down to fit the budget that we have or the financial resources that are being allocated to this particular, to solve this particular, to address this particular need, let's say. And then often we also have to do things that we already have staff who can deliver, right? We've trained people on these approaches to addressing this particular need. We know that they're equipped with the skill sets required to be able to implement this well and manage the actual implementation well. So we go ahead and do those, so there are, and none of these are there is no value judgment on any of them, because this is the environment sort of in which we operate, right? And even if you think about, if you place this particular issue of program choice in the context of needs, in the teaching at the right level context, what they did originally was the Valsaki approach was something that they only thought of one approach and decided to try it, right? And this may be because Pratham had a presence already in the region, so they were working with community volunteers on other things. They had the ability to train community volunteers, perhaps, or they had certain materials that they had previously designed that they thought would work well in this context. And this is the approach that they decided to try, right? So it comes from knowing ABC things have not worked, especially in the context of teaching at the right level. More time in school has not worked, giving them better textbooks has not worked, or additional monitoring of the teachers has not worked. They've looked at history of things that have not worked, but they've just opted for a solution that possibly fits all these 3 points, right? It may have worked elsewhere. They may have thought about what budgets governments will be comfortable with, and they may have thought, oh, we have staff who are equipped to deliver this. They definitely have staff who are equipped to assess, right? A core part of the interventional teaching at the right level is assessing children multiple times during the process and then seeing when you move them from one group to another. So they were relying on their core skill sets, which at that point, when teaching at the right level started, was assessment, right? We are able to assess literacy in children well. This is their understanding of their skill sets, and that is where they come to the program intervention from, right? What do we do well? What are our skills? And possibly what fits in the budget, in terms of, if I have to hire a community volunteer, this is what the outlay is, and then the government might be comfortable with that approach. And in some situations, they've also decided to remove that aspect altogether and have the government teachers do it themselves, right? Where it may have been a less than ideal approach, even in their understanding of this, but that's the context. Now, that particular state government does not want to pay for an additional support staff, so they have to work with training the government teachers themselves, right? So in terms of thinking, is this the best way to address this problem? Is this the best way to improve these outcomes? I don't see that you will ever really know that this is exactly the answer, but I think it's well worth thinking about the pathway that will lead from the way that you're thinking about the program, and how do you think that it's going to address this particular need that you've identified, right? Can you, I think in saying better way, there's value judgment there, right? But I think what I'm trying to say is, do you have any experiences of how you've dealt with this issue of this is the program need, and how do we go about choosing which program to implement here, even if it is just from a portfolio of things that the organization has experience with, or the organization has skill sets with, right? So this is just me hoping for some sharing on how do you process, the decision of program choice in your.
Am I audible, Vidya?
Yes, yeah.
Okay. So, there was one experience from last year in one of our projects that the project was, it was focused on early childhood education,
Mhm.
and it had a very small component of responsive parenting.
Mm.
But then and because we were aware about the realities like COVID-19 situation, because we have we already been through like the first phase, and this program came about in January 2021, if we can like exactly mention the date. So we already kind of were aware about the situations. So that is why we kept one component of responsive parenting in that program. And but we were not aware that we will see many more phases for this pandemic.
Right.
um, we started with what we were planning to start, but then looking, and when we saw the second wave, and it was all the more problematic, and
Okay.
all the more challenging and difficult, we somehow kind of changed our focus from ECE to responsive parenting, because we thought that it is actually more important at this point of time. And I won't go into the program details right now, but I think one thing which actually empowered us to take that decision was the flexibility among funders. So
Right.
the funders were like very open about the process, and they were like, they were also like kind of looking for what we can learn from the situation. So they had a perspective of learning. So instead of establishing something, instead of going somewhere at a point of time, they had this thing that we want to look for learning in the field, however it is and whenever it may come. So I think that kind of attitude helped us to actually take this decision, and uh, completely kind of transform the whole program. And it was uh, it was a very extensive responsive parenting program later on, and it went on like for almost year, I would say. And then we could also like kind of influence the state level functionaries, the
Mhm.
director and everyone. So I think when it comes to the program choice, and if we have little flexibility like that, and we all, I think we cannot deny the fact of the larger need. I think people knew that the larger need is something else right now, and they also kind of agreed to us,
Right.
the officials, the department and everyone. So I think that is something which was really helpful at that time.
Yeah, you raise a lot of important issues, like in one example, right? A being that needs assessment um, happens like periodically. You
Hmm.
have to be aware of uh, changing needs if there are, or the fact that you didn't notice a particular need or didn't give a particular need as much importance when you started, and that now that is emerging as the more important need, especially in the context of COVID. I suppose our lives changed in ways that we couldn't really imagine when we were thinking. I mean, when the wave one was happening, we didn't imagine wave two was going to be what it was. So we could not have had all the information at the time of starting the program. But the idea that evolving needs and responding to the evolving needs in order to change what you are doing is huge in terms of that flexibility, like you're saying, is not always available to us, right? Because you then I think sometimes end up coming out of a program saying this program didn't work, right? Because you didn't adapt to the needs of the community that you were working with. We come out saying, "Acha, ye kaam nahi kiya," as opposed to we had information that something different could have worked, because you didn't have the flexibility in the middle of the program to change. And I think whoever this donor was appreciative of them, because it's not a very common occurrence, right? Things are often set in stone once they're signed off. So yeah, and also appreciative of you all that you articulated this strongly enough to say we need to overhaul what we're doing, change focus, and work on this, because that is the need that that needs to be addressed at this point. Yeah, very useful. I can't see there a hand raised, so if anybody else wants to say anything? Does anyone want to respond to Rahul's comment? I mean, I think it's probably, we all find ourselves in that situation a little bit, because we're hearing often about things that have worked. All organizations are asked to make noise about things that are working. So this is what you hear most, is things that are working in organizations. You don't often hear about things that have not worked. Even in the context of, if you're thinking about research, apparently there's a huge bias of publication if you want to publish a paper that says X thing did not work, right? You have very limited chances of getting that published, as opposed to you saying this particular thing worked very, very well, I wanted to say something about, I was in this conference at Oxford earlier this year, which was bringing together 7 countries and 6 years worth of research that had been done in education about, essentially the broad mandate was, let's improve foundation literacy and numeracy. Right? This mandate was given to us 6 years ago, and 7 countries tried to do it in like various different ways. There's some 200 pieces of research that have come out of this in terms of the various things that have been tried. And broadly, at the end of a week of being in the conference, I think the consensus was, we don't know anything, right? We know lots of things that don't work, but we don't really know what exactly is going to work, and that was, in some sense, extremely depressing for me, because this was a lot of money that had gone into research, and people just trying things out in small controlled spaces to see, can we make this work, right? So the idea that you learn from other organizations, and do what they're doing well, or not do what has not worked for them, I think is one of the important sources of information that we have currently about how do we think about program choice, right? And it's important that we take into account things that have not worked, for sure. There's also this huge push for edtech in our current context in many states. Any technology based education intervention, I think it's part of our COVID reality. Is we decided tech was the answer to not being able to go to school in person, and I think that has caused such a surge of options of, what can I do to solve this problem, that we're not talking enough about things that have not worked in these contexts. Yeah. I mean, I think, sorry, just to respond to Suraj's comment, I think internally they said we don't know. I don't know what the message to the larger community is going to be, right? And there was a lot of dissent within the community saying, how can we actually say this after 6 years that we don't know anything, that we have not yet found something that can be reasonably useful for the children in our, children who are in schools right now. And I think that conference was one of the big drivers for me to think more and more about monitoring and evaluation seriously, because the number of programs that get implemented, the large number of resources that get spent without people really knowing, is there, has anything happened here, is, I think, is criminal in our context. So exactly, yeah. Sorry, do you want to elaborate, Suraj, on unlearning in education?
Well, this might take us a little farther away from maybe the topic, but of course, I share your frustration, after all this, but still better than, saying we've done all this work, we now have to produce something, right?
Yeah.
We have to, we have to create knowledge for the sake of it, because how can we have seem to have failed after all this? And there are a lot of alternative education groups which emphasize unlearning. There's at least outside the mainstream. And I think philosophically the point is, much that we know about the world comes from a place where, which is not questioned enough. And so I was just thinking, if it's true for unlearning, schools, then should it not be true at the broader level? But this takes us a little far afield, so that's why,
but I think in this context, especially because there is some pressure on all of us to find the right answer and solve these problems, right? Because as organizations working in the sector, we really think, it's because of some kind of desire to do good that the organization exists, and there is pressure to find, let's say broadly, there are some that don't fall in this category, but broadly the goal is to make some kind of difference to the situation, and that you walk away from I do not walk away, but if you leave a space better than it was before you came into it. But often, the idea that you acknowledge that this has not happened is quite important, and have what it takes to then either drop or tweak or really overhaul what you're doing in order for it to align better with what the needs are. So, yeah. And we don't have the space. I don't think we get the space very easily to do that. Sorry. Yeah. So I think in the context of all the uncertainty with which we go into design, right? We go into thinking, how should we do it? Who should we do it with? How many times should we do it? All of these questions that we try to answer in designing a program. I think this is just sort of hints on what should we try to keep in mind while we do this. And most importantly, of course, is the outcomes need to be like crystal clear always, right? And again, as basic as it sounds, often we're not able to articulate what the outcomes, what the desired outcomes are of the program that we want to do, or what are we trying to change, what is the current outcome, how do we want to shift it, is something that program implementers, designers are often not able to articulate. And I think also the complexity with which, through which the intervention is going to address the need is also something that we need to take like we need to take into account very seriously. If you remember Suraj's diagram about inputs, outputs, outcomes, so that diagram, and I think he mentioned it several times, was linear in that particular slide. It's never really linear, right? So there are various loops that things go through before an output happens or an outcome happens, and we need to be aware of these things while we're designing. To a certain extent we can be aware, which is, I think, comes from our previous experience of trying to do this. It comes from learning from other people's experiences of trying to do this. So we need to, we need to just acknowledge to ourselves, this is what you're trying to do is hard, right? And there are factors that we will never be able to control with the things that we do. But we need to be able to articulate quite clearly how we think this is going to progress, right? At least even if it is an incomplete articulation, right? There may be things that we don't see when we're articulating, but we still need to be able to articulate how we think what we're doing is going to shift the outcomes, right? That's very important, because that isn't like image is showing, that isn't a miracle that occurs in the middle. There are various factors that take place that we need to sort of take cognizance of, and I think this is where the flexibility also comes into play, that you think about this before, at the design stage, before you've started doing anything, right? We're not working with school yet, and you're still trying to imagine what are all these factors that could influence the outcomes that I'm trying to address. And then as you go into implementing, you obviously are getting more information about all the various factors that are influencing the program that we're delivering. And then those need to be taken into account into that image in our heads about what happens between inputs and outputs, and what happens between outputs translating into outcomes, right? Yeah, so like I said, we need to, everything that you've done before is knowledge that we need to take into account. And like Suraj was saying, if there is an unlearning that needs to be done, right, then that also is something that we need to accept, that X thing is not going to, is not solving the problem. We need to think about this differently, you know. And inputs from stakeholders. I think several of you have mentioned that you take inputs from stakeholders concurrently during the program to figure out what is happening, how is this being, how did we imagine this would translate on the ground, and how is it actually sort of transpiring, and what do we need to do? Do we need to put additional support somewhere? Do we need to put an additional, like a middle activity that we didn't think of that is essential for your program to actually address that particular need, and things like that, right? So I think it's important. I think this slide is, for me, really drilling in the importance of monitoring as well as program choice at the beginning, right? We need program choice. While it does happen broadly at the beginning, it also is something that is constantly evolving. And do we have the flexibility to evolve along with what we're learning from, the stakeholders about how this thing is working? And at what point do you decide to change things, right? And how often can you really do that in order, I don't know, there are real constraints, right? If I find out something is happening 3 months into the program, I may have flexibility to change it. If I find out it's happening 6 months later, I may not have flexibility to change it. I don't know, it's all dependent on what the reality on the ground is. But just to say that we need to think evaluatively about program choice as well. And that would mean thinking about outcomes always. Often, what happens is that we get really embroiled in implementation, gaps in implementation, ye nahi ho raha hai, this is not being delivered, things like that. But there may be information there about why this is not happening that is valuable for you to think about the way that you've designed the activity, right? So just to say, design is also an iterative process, and that it's also something that evolves as you're learning more things, about the group you're working with, about how your program activities are working. And of course, the other thing that often determines program choice is financial resources, right? Um, there are several cases that come to mind for me about places where we've had to tone down the program because the way that you wanted to do it is not going to fit within the budget, right? And that you may know from either from previous experience or from, I don't know, existing research or from what you're hearing from the stakeholders, that you need to do it X particular way or X number of times, but it just may not be something that you can accommodate in terms of resources, especially if things are being done at scale. There may be a situation where you cannot deploy the kind of manpower that is required to do it well, to do it tightly, and you have to sort of say, okay, this is all that can be done at this point, and what trade-offs do we make at that stage, right? Do we decide uh, number of times something is done versus number of places in which it's done versus number of people who do it, all of those things, right? Like one sort of thing that's coming to mind in terms of this particular trade-off thing is I've often been asked by donors to not do small things, like to conduct teacher trainings for 100 teachers together, because the space will come from the state. You just need to deploy one trainer, and then you're kind of increasing the number of people that this trainer is dealing with, right? And that I might know as an organization is not going to have the intended, the intended outcome is not going to come from me training 100 teachers together, but often that's all I may be able to do. So there are real trade-offs that sometimes we make because of cost considerations alone, right? And not, I mean, even though you know that there's a better way to do this, you may not have the cost wriggle room to be able to do it. And then I think it's important to think about, if resources are tight, then how do we, I say if resources are tight, but I think it's when resources are tight, which is true for most of us. How do you explore alternate approaches to improve the outcomes, right? And in this context, one thing that I've been thinking about quite seriously is about large scale implementation, right? Especially when organizations want to do things in partnership with the state. So, I think it's a reality in India that if you want to do things at scale, you need to partner with the state. You need the state to be like the state government, whatever the educational department, functionaries, all of them to be an active part of whatever you're doing, because otherwise it really doesn't make sense that when this structure exists, you deploy a parallel structure of your own, right? But then when it is in that state, how do you really think about, how do you manage the monitoring? How do you manage the the quality at which you wanted to deliver anything that you want to deliver, a training, I don't know, any intervention that you wanted to deliver? How do you manage the quality of this while ensuring that resources, while in a context where resources are tight, right? And I think I struggle with it also because often the kind of comments that get made are, if you're working with the state, things will take time, you will not see results immediately, they will not come on board, it's not their priority, things like that. So there are a bunch of considerations that we're working with, and we need to really be, I think, creative about what are the alternate approaches that you can use, and maybe this requires us to think outside what we're used to doing, and think about what are there other ways to sort of tackle this situation, right? Yeah, so this is, I think all of this, like the discussion throughout the session has been thinking about design, needs assessment, and program choice being sort of the critical components of design, but thinking about them in an evaluative perspective, right? Applying evaluative thinking to needs assessment and to program choice, like both sitting into each other. And I think the idea, when I say evaluative thinking, I mean to try and question literally everything, right? Not really take anything as we know this to be true, but to really question everything from the beginning. And one of the sort of core aspects of evaluation for me is evaluating design, right? Because you need to think about, and mostly, I think what Suraj has mentioned in previous sessions is mostly what gets done in evaluation is evaluation of impact, right? And one of you had also raised in the previous session saying, what if the design is bad, right? If design is bad, then you may not have any impact, and then your evaluation of impact doesn't even provide information on the fact that it was designed that was bad or whatever. But just to say that from the time that you think about design, we need to understand that things are changing and that we need to have some sense of the fact that even design is evolving, right? It's not we have designed this program and we're now going to deliver it, and then we will evaluate either evaluate its implementation or evaluate its impact, right? And when I say here, identify the gap between current outcomes and expected outcomes, I think it just means know the space that you're working in, right? Try and understand the space that you're working in, and really be helpful in us trying to go towards what it is that we want to get. Often we're working maybe 2 steps after what the actual place that we need to be working in is. So as often as possible, as far as possible, we should try and think about what is the gap that we're trying to fill and how does this program fill this gap, right? That articulation is very, very important, and obviously the pathway, right? Because if I know this is the gap, and if I understand how this program, it's my imagination, obviously, how I plan this program to address this gap, then it's also important that we articulate how this is going to happen, right? What are the various influences the program is going to have that I don't necessarily have control over, or I may not be intervening in, and this is going to happen anyway. So we need to also try and articulate the pathway in which the program is going to achieve or is going to address the gap in the outcomes, right? I feel like I've been talking for very long. Does anybody have any questions or thoughts at this point? Is it all seeming like ये सब सुनने में तो बहुत अच्छा है, but how do we do this when, I mean, this is not really practical when we're actually trying to design things. I hope it's not sounding like that. Okay. I think we're nearing the end actually. Wow. So we have time. So one of the things, so because this is a what do you call it? This is like a festival break. The next week we don't have a class, and it's a festival break. We don't necessarily have a homework exercise at this point. Sorry, 1 second. Yeah, we could possibly take Suraj's question if you all have seen it. Do you have examples where program strategy, two different program strategy options were discussed at some point? Do you have an example, Suraj?
I have a thin example. I don't know whether it will count. With Rahul here.
Alright.
Again,
Can't quite hear it.
am I audible?
It's soft. I don't know if it's just me.
Okay. Is this better?
Yeah.
Okay. So, again, say in the we have been trying to do some work in the library space, and one is connecting it to there is a kind of a obviously a connection to the need of levels of language learning among children. Same thing as TAL, but focusing on language.
Mhm.
Now, there are, in some sense, two camps within the library kind of programs that are there. So one is very wedded to the idea that libraries should be just spaces, safe spaces for children, activity spaces. It should supplement the classroom session. It shouldn't at all be a substitute for the classroom work, because anyway what you're doing in the classroom is quite bad, and if you continue doing more bad in the library space, you are just harming the children more. So that's one's idea. The other, which again, I think there are community specific differences also, so context specific. The other idea is that you could have structured sessions within the library sessions, which complement what is happening in the classroom. And teachers, if they make an effort, and if you can connect the teachers to the library program, they might be able to take up some of the structured learning on language which we are doing, mostly around reading, into the classroom. Now, those are things which we have discussed again in terms of and seen different organizations placing emphasis on different things, and have thought about choosing a particular approach and trying out something. Again, we are not sure whether we are on the right track, but there is a kind of like a choice there that is being made, whether we are not going with the idea that library should be just spaces for safe spaces for children, but going with the idea that that library can be there can be structured learning spaces within the library, but again well designed and very minimal time within the library session. That's something I don't know whether it qualifies as a kind of a choice, but again we have spoken to different people who have worked in the library space organizations and taken this kind of a call.
I think it totally works as a good example, Rahul. And I was going to say I was going to ask, what was it that that drove you to this to choose option A versus the other one? And I think you indicated briefly that it was conversations with people uh, who were who have experience in the sector to say, you know, pros and cons of both options possibly. But is there anything else? Was there
Yeah.
some ideological stance that?
Yeah, one is in some sense a pragmatic, strategic one also. So if so there is this big push on FLN which we are talking about,
Right.
and the state wouldn't be the state is doing library work, different states, but again the interest of the state is very clearly wedded to FLN.
Right.
If you can, if you're thinking of working with the state as a partner, having a kind of a component which shows structured learning within the library seems, I mean, we thought would have a better buy-in from state.
Yeah.
So that's one of the reasons. So it may not be the best possible choice in terms of say given looking at it from the children's perspective or how educationists or library educators look at it. But there was a pragmatic consideration of that.
Yeah. Thanks. I think that really helps think about the reasons why we make choice sometimes, right? Because it may also I mean, the idea that if you want to continue doing this, you need buy-in from the state is a real consideration we need to take into account. And often, even if it is not, I mean, we don't know in this case, but even if it is not the best possible approach to address a need, if you want to consistently be able to try something, consistently be able to do something, then you may need to choose a path that is more practical um, in terms of buy-in, in terms of possibly financial support. I don't know if you're getting from the state, but yeah. Yeah, does anyone else have an example of this type?
I also have an example, but I'd prefer to hear from Vikramshila folks first.
I'm withholding my example. um, Suresh, maybe you want to share your.
Absolutely. Whether we want to listen to Ditya or we want to
Of
go back to
course.
laughing.
I mean, I think it's part of the problem here is that this was outside the mandate, right? This Friday was not supposed to happen as per the mandate, so they may have made plans that we have now suddenly thrown a wrench in, and as a result, you can't really expect everyone to turn their lives. So yeah, it is a matter of choice, of course. Sorry, Suraj, you want to share the example?
Yeah, okay. One small one is this is from a program called Shiksha Sambal in 4-5 districts of Rajasthan, working with about 60 government schools. This was when I was at Vidya Bhavan. It's still continuing the program. And so one of the tasks given by the funder was to improve the board exam results for class 10 and for class 12 science. And when it came to discussing how do we improve class 12 science results, there were two different program strategies which were discussed. One was some kind of equivalent of the Bal Sakhi, which is to get field personnel and work with kids during and after school and so on. And the second was to prepare material given where these kids were, given their backgrounds and worksheets, and basically get it done through the regular school by a little bit of liaising with the teachers. And we ended up actually choosing the second, which is not to deploy kind of Bal Sakhi equivalents to do it, but just to prepare and distribute material. Meanwhile, for the class 10 board result mandate, we actually went with the first strategy, or a combination material and this and camps, sort of like the Pratham model. And for the class 12, I'm specifying the class 12 part because there it was largely feasibility which drove the program choice. It was just not possible to get sufficient teachers in those areas who knew science at a +2 level on a sustained basis and so on. So so I think these two program strategies were discussed in some detail, and then ultimately the decision was taken based on purely on logistics. So that's one example.
Thank you. I think that's it's also really insightful about, we think, it's often thought, is this the best way to do this? But there are so many other factors other than the effectiveness of a particular approach that determine what actually gets done, and that may be the best you can do at that particular point, right? So I think just what both Rahul and Suraj have just articulated is the process through which that decision was arrived at, right? And that articulation is probably what is key in program choice, is knowing why are you choosing this particular approach, and the reason for that, it needs to be justified only to yourselves at that particular point in time. But knowing that this is the pathway that we took to arrive at this decision is critical, and it shouldn't be that it was just ad hoc, let's do this approach, as opposed to we think about both, we decide we discuss the feasibility, the pros and cons, the practicality of doing these things, and arrive at an option that works in the current context, in the current resource availability structure. So, yeah. I think the example that I was going to share is quite similar to what Suraj was saying, and it was in the context of this whole English medium introduction in Jharkhand, and the ideal approach should have been, let's say the most sustainable approach should have been that teachers are equipped to handle an English medium textbook or the English language textbook that is being used, and then they teach the children how to deal with the textbook, all of that stuff. Whatever was, what would happen in a context where everybody is equipped to learn English medium, where the system is supporting English medium instruction. We would have had to train teachers earlier, but there were children who were in class 9 and class 10 who could not possibly suddenly learn enough to be able to if it followed the organic language learning approach, they were not going to be able to get there as quickly as the system wanted them to, right? So the choices we had were either we do this and say this is the right way to, I mean, this is the best way to learn a language, and we follow that approach, or we say at this point the only thing that's important in terms of language for them is that they clear class 10, right? And we did unfortunately take the second, unfortunately, but we did take the second approach, and it involved us sitting and breaking down like the exam paper to see where can you get like that pass mark of 35 easiest, and working on those skills alone with children who were very close to board exam, right? Because you didn't want them to not clear the exam just because they hadn't learned English enough and the state had decided to change its mind overnight. So for classes who were approaching the board exam quite soon, that's what we did. And for the earlier classes, class 1, class 2, we started as let's learn language, English as another language, and how can we do this organically? So that, I mean, you often have to make choices that are not and may not be the most ideal, but in that situation, that was the need that needed to be addressed, right? So yeah. Okay. So I think this is something that I just wanted to think about. I would have asked for a written submission, but I am not asking for written submission at this point because this is a festival week, and I really don't want to add anything into this. But I'm assuming that all of you are, I mean, most of you probably are tied to a specific program or programs. And I think if you could, so in the next sort of phase of this, we will be dealing with very specific questions from the programs that you actually work with, as opposed to us looking at teaching at the right level, which is the case that we will talk about theoretically for the moment. But I wanted you to start thinking about any program that you work with closely, and that you sort of intend to use that to learn more, during this course. And if you could just think about what are the needs for that particular group, that the program that you're thinking of that you work with, what and are these activities that you're currently implementing, are they best suited, and if not, then why have you chosen these particular activities to address these needs? And like, now that you have some experience working with implementation of this project, can you think of any alternate approaches that you would now be willing to consider, right? So if you could just think about these things, we will bring it up again briefly when we meet, just as a way to sort of recap and pull together needs assessment and program design as a conversation, and then we will move forward, right? Is this clear, I hope, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, wonderful. I think that's it from me. Yeah, that's it from me. Suraj, Rahul, anything else you want to add at this point? When are we meeting next? I'll just tell you 1 second. I think it's the week after. Week of the 7th is the next week we're not meeting. 14th would be the next session. So as per our plan, we're meeting on the 14th. If you all can just discuss internally and confirm, then that would be great. But 7th for sure, we're not meeting on the 7th. Okay, wonderful. I'm going back to teacher mode, which I don't like, but I have to do. I just wanted to take some time to talk about session 1 assignment and just check. I understand that there's a lot going on, and Rahul kind of gave me a heads up on the fact that it's a very, very busy time at the moment at Vikramshila. But also to ask questions around, is the nature of the assignment appropriate, or would you think that anything else is required from, I mean, a different kind of an assignment would be better received, because we still have only a third of the participants who have uploaded their responses to the first assignment, right? So I just wanted to check. I didn't want us to push for something that is not very palatable at this point. So if anyone can just
Yeah, you are suggesting that these questions we work on like a doc file and share it, or is there a template that we will send and we will kind of fill up our thoughts on it?
No, not these. This I don't. Sorry, can you hear me?
Yeah.
I'm saying internet is unstable anyway. So I was saying not these I don't want you to write out, but
Okay.
we had Suraj had shared a series of questions in the first session that we wanted to be responded to in the context of TAN, right? And in the Google Drive space that Nani has shared, I think there are about 6 responses thus far, right? So I'm just wondering if the reason we haven't heard from the others is because I'm not trying to find out why, you know. Mostly because should we change the nature of the kind of things we ask for? Is it are there language considerations I need to take care of? Is there a time thing that we need to be aware of? That's something I just want to know, because it's an important way for us to understand how much people are absorbing, mostly because not everybody is vocal, right, on in session. So that's the only space we have to get a sense of what is being assimilated, and I think that's important. So I just wanted to check if there's any feedback on that.
Personally, for me, it was a time thing. Like, but I don't know about others. I think we cannot take this opportunity to talk about the challenges we're facing.
Also, Dvitya, if
Hmm.
I may add,
Mhm.
sometimes the questions, especially in the first section, we could still
Mhm.
navigate some of the questions in there. The
Mhm.
other 2 sections, I think we don't
Understood.
have enough exposure to the sessions right now to answer those questions.
Mhm.
So I know, because a lot of people have been approaching me
Mhm.
saying that they could only do a part of the assignment. So
Totally okay. Ask them to upload that part, no, please.
yeah, I'll do that.
Yeah.
I'll do.
Because we are fully cognizant of the fact that there is pieces of this that we have not discussed sufficiently yet, and we've not provided enough information in the case study for you to be able to pull it out of there as well. The idea broadly was that you start thinking about these things. That's also any, to whatever extent they're able to, would be useful for us to have submission essentially, so that we can also get a sense of what is not clear yet, you know. And if you could also, I don't know, internally check if there's anything else in terms of feedback that you want to bring to us, then we're happy to take it on.
I'll ask the group and then I'll
Yeah.
get back to you on that, Vidya.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
Yes, okay. Wonderful. I think that's it. And well, it's 4 minutes before plan, but thanks again to everyone for coming today in what is a very busy, as personally as well as professionally week, I suppose, and I'm grateful for the participation. So I think we're planning next on 14. Then if you can just also confirm that 14th works, right?
Yeah, as soon as I hear from the rest of them,
Yeah.
I'll communicate to you. Yeah.
Wonderful.
Okay.
Okay. Thanks so much.
Thanks a lot, Vidya,
Thanks.
Suraj, Rahul.
Thanks, bye-bye. I don't know how to wish people for puja, but happy
neither,
puja, that's the thing.
neither do I. Let's come back to work quickly. Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you. Bye.
Bye.